I'm Rashmin Sagoo. I'm the Director of the International Law Programme here at Chatham House, and I'm delighted to be welcoming Victoria Prentis, KC, Attorney General, the UK's government's Chief Legal Advisor, since October 2022. And prior to 2022, Victoria has a long record in service as a UK government lawyer on various issues of domestic and international law. Attorney General, it's a big virtual welcome to Chatham House this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I know you've got a very...
Thank you for having me, Rashmin. It's great to be here. I'm just really sorry I can't be with you in person.
No, we do understand, and I'm aware that you've not been able to join us for all the discussions today, so I'll try and feed in some of the thoughts in our Q&A later. However, if you wouldn't mind giving us your high-level remarks on today's discussions, please.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed. I've been asked to give you some personal reflections on the conflict. Ukraine is a very big deal for me personally, and I have loved it for several years. And I think it is important that occasionally we do step back from our professional lives and think about what this means for us, both as lawyers and as others reacting to the dreadful events. So February's 2-year anniversary marked another milestone and another chapter in Ukraine's history. The devastation that's been wrought by the Russian aggression is plain for us all to see on the news, but it is true that we are becoming slightly inured to the pictures that we do see. For anybody in the audience who visited Ukraine before the conflict will understand very clearly why we must support this beautiful country as it seeks to rebuild itself. My daughter worked in Kyiv a few years ago, and I have very fond memories of visiting her there at the end of 2021. It was an extraordinarily beautiful week in weather terms. There was bright sunlight shining on the fabulous churches and cathedral roofs, and the sky was blue, and everything was perfect and vibrant and busy in Kyiv that week. And I met some of her lovely friends, including a young woman called Vika. Young people who were at the start of their lives, full of optimism for the future, very outward-looking, very international. And for our family, like many UK families, the conflict has become a very personal thing, because we welcomed Vika into our home in Oxfordshire at the beginning of the year, so just over 2 years ago. And she is now, of course, a completely integral part of our family, and we can't imagine life without her. So the place names that we see on the news, the sites where there's been significant damage or loss of life, that most recently, very sadly, in Odessa this week, represent places that Vika has friends or family, or she's visited, or she went to school. And it makes it very, very real for me and my family to play out these emotions round the kitchen table. I returned to Ukraine last year in my formal role as Attorney General, and helping the Ukrainian Prosecutor General has been a very, very significant part of my day-to-day work. On that visit, I knew that things would look different, but the images that we see on the news don't really in any way express the horror of what is happening on the ground. Kyiv looked very different, not from a distance, but as soon as you get there, the sandbags in the main square, the closure of cafes and restaurants, the real horror of seeing so many injured combatants shows how this conflict has impacted everyone's life. Some of the really harrowing sites were in Bucha and Borodyanka, so on the road into Kyiv. And all of those present in the audience will remember what happened and what was uncovered in both of those places. Borodyanka, about 30 miles northwest of Kyiv, was hit by some really significant missile strikes very early on in the conflict. And I vividly remember visiting the apartment blocks, people's lives just stopped in a moment, and the twisted wreckage of the building still visible for all to see. In Bucha, I was able to lay a wreath at a site where last year 116 people were bodies were uncovered in a mass grave. 2 years ago, I should say. I laid my wreath exactly a year after that dreadful act was discovered. And it was interesting to see the pictures, the media reporting of Sophie Wessex's trip to Bucha this week. It's significant how much rebuilding and how fabulous the memorial is there now. Real thought is going into memory and how we remember and mark the lives of those who've died in this conflict, I think. The World Bank estimates the damage, the physical damage that's been done at about $500 billion, but I suspect the true figure is much higher. Hospitals, schools, roads, and countless civic buildings on which we all rely for our everyday lives have been destroyed. And the damage to people's homes is extraordinary. I'm really proud of the way the UK government has stood in support of Ukraine. Sir Howard Morrison, a former judge at the ICC, has become our gift, if you like, our direct gift to Prosecutor General Costin, and is an independent advisor to him, and has been very involved in training judges in how to run a war crimes tribunal, not something anybody ever thought we would need to train that quantity of judges to do. He's trained more than 100 so far in a really systematic and detailed way. I've been involved in various ways. I joined G7 justice ministers in signing the Berlin Declaration, coordinating the international investigations and prosecutions, and in pledging solidarity of the legal community with Ukraine. Just last month, I attended the ministerial session of the Conference of the Parties of the Register of Damages for Ukraine. The UK, along with 43 other states in the EU, have joined this Register of Damages. And I think this is a significant moment. It will serve as a record of the loss or injury that ordinary Ukrainians have suffered because of the Russian aggression. And I hope it will form a sort of important mechanism to document those losses and help us to make sure that that those who suffered are in some way compensated. I don't say any of this in a spirit of self-congratulation, but I do think we've all come a long way in the last 2 years, and that what has been achieved as an international community is an extraordinary achievement. The path is obviously extremely long and difficult. Everybody is tired in Ukraine, and this war is very wearing. But it is important that we remember where we've come from. This is an unlawful war of aggression on another sovereign state, an occupation of territory, execution of civilians, abducting civilians, including children, and bombing cities. The Ukrainian people have shown extraordinary courage and resilience, and they have mobilized themselves to, in turn, mobilize the international community in a way which is extraordinary. But they are really struggling. Significant assets are immobilized now, but it is undoubtedly the case that Russia must pay reparations for the damage that it's caused. Ukraine urgently needs financial support to help the country survive and begin the task of rebuilding. I know this, and how the cost of repair must be recovered are things that you're talking about today. And I know that it's not an easy discussion, and that there are many strong and legitimate arguments that need to be considered as we work to find a way forward. The UK government will not leave any stone unturned in working with partners around the world to make sure that we try to use the immobilized Russian sovereign assets to help Ukraine in any way we can. We won't get all the answers today, but I think it's important that we continue to discuss and to build momentum on this issue. It's clear to me every time I go to Ukraine that even though it may look different, the people are just the same. They have, of course, been battered by this conflict, but they are very resilient. So it's important that we continue to help them.
Thank you very much, Attorney General, for those very personal and moving reflections, really rooting us whilst we sit here in Chatham House in London, really rooting us in the reality of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, and also giving us a sense of the impact on individual Ukrainians as well. So somewhat reluctantly, but I would like to turn us to the law now as well. The G7 leaders' statement from the 24th of February 2004, earlier this year, essentially set out that the G7 will continue to work on all possible avenues by which immobilized Russian sovereign assets could be made use of to support Ukraine, consistent with their respective legal systems and international law. Now, I'm aware that given discussions are ongoing and G7 states are still formulating their positions, that you may not be able to get into the legal detail today. I do have a few other questions, although I should note that earlier we had the Canadian Deputy Prime Minister who was more forward-leaning, I would say, in the Canadian position. But perhaps you could give us a sense of, I should say, I'm aware you were also not able to sit in on our earlier discussions, but we were trying to cover the myriad economic, political, moral, and legal issues that decision makers have to, that you're all grappling with at the moment. So I wondered, could you give a flavour of the UK government's decision-making processes and how, in particular, the legal issues, these really complicated, challenging questions that Alison MacDonald-Casey earlier really beautifully outlined for us, how will they be factored into your decision-making? Will it include Foreign Office legal advice, advice across across departments, and how does that balance work?
Yeah, that's a big question, Rashmin, but I'll do my best. So law is very important to the UK government. I, as the attorney, sit in cabinet, and when I speak on legal matters, I'm broadly listened to. That's what I'm there for. I'm consulted as the sort of in-house lawyer. I obviously, though, and you will understand, and you've probably talked about today, other bits of government are involved in these really significant discussions about asset seizure. And the sanctions regime has been sort of organised in government, both across the Foreign Office, but also across the Treasury, who have a whole team, well, a fantastic team, I visit them fairly often, involved in immobilising those Russian assets. And this was a really big deal and remains a really big deal for the UK government. We've done an enormous amount of work on it, and we've got a large number of very, very capable lawyers working on it. In conjunction with that, we also, of course, work with legal professionals, including Alison, who's been in to talk to me about Ukraine, and I've seen her elsewhere as well. And also international lawyers. So I talk both to political counterparts abroad and those involved in justice ministries, but also to academics who work in universities. And I've brought groups of those people together in the course of the last 20 months or so to discuss how we go forward. Now, I'm not allowed to tell you what advice I give to the government, but I think it's clear from some of the statements of the Foreign Secretary recently in particular that the UK government is very forward-leaning on our ability to use frozen assets, and that the Foreign Secretary is very much driving this work with his counterparts. So it is going to be a collegiate effort. I'm very keen that we use all parts of our legal world, if you like. So the academic one, the practicing bar, Timothy has been involved. We've taken very broad advice. We've also work closely with the judiciary, and many of them, including the former Lord Chief, is very keen to help in any way that we can. So our help has both been practical in terms of making sure that we collect and save evidence in a way that is going to be useful. It's been organisational, if you like, in terms of the register of damages, but it's also been, I think I'd call it legal diplomacy, which is where we are with asset seizure at the moment.
Thank you. And so on that legal diplomacy, the considerations you're outlining between various lawyers within the UK, both within government and outside of government, will be replicated within all the G7 states, and they're trying to figure out individually and then collectively what the position ought to be. There's been frustration here, including today, outside Chatham House, inside Chatham House, that everything's still moving so slowly in terms of finding lawful avenues for repurposing frozen Russian assets, as I'm sure you're aware, and equal frustration levelled at the multilateral processes. What's your take on progress made? You hinted at it in your earlier remarks, but when and where are solutions to be found? There was a suggestion earlier that really we need to be moving within the next 6 to 7 weeks, and we're way off the mark on that. So what's your take?
Okay, so it's not just G7 either, I should say. I know you heard from the Canadians earlier. We've been working, well, they are obviously our G7, but it's wider than that. And we've been very keen to involve other nations around the world who are not in the G7. So the Canadians in particular have been very helpful in encouraging countries in Africa, for example, to be drawn into our wider discussions. And that, I think, is important. I'm just thinking back to the summer of 2022, when before I was AG, I was still the farming minister, and I went to the UN to talk about Ukrainian grain, which at that time was very troubling for large portions of the world because it wasn't being exported, and large portions of the world had come to rely on it for food. And the atmosphere of at the UN when discussing Russia's illegal invasion came as something of a surprise, and it felt very volatile and very difficult to manage. Thinking back to that experience and the diplomatic work that is done in the UN and has been done in order to get a degree of consensus around this, how to deal with the illegal aggression, I do feel that we have come quite a long way working with the G7, but also with friends and allies across the world in order to do what we need to do. There has been so much legal work done, and I think occasionally we forget that in our keenness to make sure that we get Ukraine everything it needs. Of course, we all want Ukraine to have the money and the arms to fight this war effectively. Of course we do. And I completely understand why people are keen to do that quickly. But these are really difficult legal concepts. The concept of people's property, the A1P1 ideas are really, really fundamental to what we think our role as lawyers is. And it is so important.
Just briefly.
Article 1, Protocol 1, so the right to own property and the right to hold property. And what we're doing, of course, in freezing assets and then possibly giving the assets to others is a very significant intervention into that concept. So these are difficult ideas, and we don't, it is much better if lawyers, if we take a little bit longer and we go together with partners. It's really interesting where the bulk of these assets lie. It's not necessarily in the countries that you might expect. So we need to make sure when working with our friends and allies across the world that we bring on board those countries which have the largest amount of assets frozen. And I think it's worth taking a bit longer if we are able to do that. It's been clear from the beginning that there are some nations which are very front-footed on supporting Ukraine. I think everybody would put the UK firmly in that category. Canada has also been firmly in that category, and they have a very, very large Ukrainian diaspora there.
So I'm just going to pause you.
Sorry.
If you wrap up your point, sorry, I've got one last question, just conscious of
Okay, I'm sorry. I could go on forever about this.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off, but did you want to finish that point?
No, you go for it.
It's just simply to say, because we're coming into the next panel session, and very sorry that you're not able to join us for that. But this is perhaps an odd question coming from me, but some people ask, and you may have heard it yourself, I'm sure, what's the point of international law here? Particularly if it gets in the way of doing what we want. And you're saying that the Canadians, the UK, the Brits are being forward-leaning. What's the point of it if it's stopping it happening?
I think I'd flip that question on its head, but I would. I'm a lawyer, and say law is the basis for much of the good that we do in society. If we talk about the rule of law here, but it is really, really significant. The reason, one of the reasons that we are so horrified by what has happened in Ukraine is that it is contrary to our view of what is fair and what is just. And I would say this, I'm a lawyer, I think that law underpins all of the things that we care about and makes sure that society can function properly. I'd say that just as much for domestic law as for international law. International law is struggling here. Of course it is. These are difficult ideas. There has been an illegal invasion. So international law is under strain in new and different ways, very sadly, as we're seeing around the world at this time. Every so often, notably after the Second World War, we sit down as a group of friends and allies and work out how we think we're going to organise ourselves, how we're going to run the international rules-based order in what we perceive to be the future. We are having to adapt the ideas and concepts that we've come up with and did come up with after that dreadful conflict. And we are going to have to do that again. And I think it's right that we accept the limitations of the law that we've got. But we must do it. And I believe that very strongly.
Attorney General Victoria Prentis, thank you very much for joining us today.